countries like Ecuador and Bolivia when they refused to sign on to the Copenhagen Accord. John Vidal, the environment editor for the London Guardian, reported on the exchange. John Vidal covered the UN climate talks in Copenhagen and is in Cancun covering the summit here. His newspaper is one of 5 news outlets to receive the massive trove of WikiLeaks cables ahead of time and has been publishing new revelations every day. I asked John Vidal about the latest diplomatic cables on the U.S. and the U.S. manipulation of the climate talks.
We've lifted the lid on what actually happens at conferences like that, and we begin to see the kind of intense pressure and arm twisting and blackmail and different tactics which have always been used by the rich countries over the poor countries. The only new thing now is that it is we actually have it written down. We can see it for the first time with our own eyes. So what we tried to report 2 years ago, 3 years ago, whatever, now we actually know. We know for a fact this happened and that happened and he said that to what. The surprising thing is it's not surprising in a funny way. I mean, it's like we always suspected that this is how America operates, and now we know. So in a way, our information was good at the time. I think that Bolivia and other countries' reaction has been very, very interesting, because that's that outrage that how the rich have been bullying and press ganging the poor. It's a terrible situation.
You refer to the terrible night in Copenhagen. Explain exactly what you meant, what went down and what was revealed in the WikiLeaks documents.
Copenhagen was just a complete nightmare, a diplomatic meltdown, I think is the first way to say it, where you had countries accusing each other of genocide. You had a total failure of the diplomatic process. Text which was meant to enhance everybody and bring them together, in fact, did the absolute opposite, and it shattered the confidence and the trust between different countries. And WikiLeaks just shows us from that one point of view of the American cables. But this was happening in many, many other countries. It wasn't just America. If we could get hold of the British equivalent of WikiLeaks, or the French, or the Germans, or the Canadians, or whatever, we would see similar things. I'm quite sure. This is international diplomacy, which is a very, very dirty business.
What about the money that was offered to countries, the tens of millions of dollars that we see in the WikiLeaks documents, for example, offered to places like Maldives, the country that was fierce, their representatives, about getting some kind of global warming deal at Copenhagen, and then signed on to the accord?
Well, I mean, that's how these meetings work. I mean, frankly, it goes to the line, and at the end there is this horse trading thing. Well, I'll give you money if you side with me. This is how the world works. I mean, we're seeing it very clearly. It is not a sort of amiable negotiation. People are using every tactic under the book, including blackmail, including finance. They're using muscle. They're threatening, and that's what happens in the last hours of these conferences. And we'll see a game that's similar this time. It won't be quite as bad because there's not so much at stake in this particular meeting. But when it goes forward next year to Durban, we will see exactly the same stuff, and even in spades we'll see far more.
Why is there less at stake here in Cancun?
Because they're not trying to find a final agreement. They're trying to find a path to a final agreement. So they've limited their ambition is much less than it was last year. So they're going to push it all forward to next year, so they can have more talks in between and whatever. But they have to make some very, very important decisions, and even to get to there, they will need to twist arms. But they won't. I don't think we'll be seeing the money. I don't think we'll be seeing that kind of pressure as we saw last time. There's trillions of dollars at stake. I mean, that's the point about this. For a country to offer $100 million to another country in these circumstances is not great, when the prize may be 10 billion or 100 billion. I mean, a red agreement on forests may be worth $30 billion a year to carbon markets, to developing countries. A good deal on carbon markets might be worth 100 billion. I mean, we're talking about massive flows of money here, and so it's not surprising that countries are offered or being offered, an awful lot of money under the counter and things like that.
John Vidal, there are many fewer of the elite media represented here. Some might say is because they act as stenographers to power, that the leaders are not here. Maybe there'll be 20 leaders here, but before at Copenhagen there were 120, and so they don't bother coming. And when they don't bother coming, it doesn't rev up the conversation in their country about this critical issue of global warming. So in Copenhagen we saw thousands of journalists packed into the press halls. Here we're often in a room with no one else.
Yeah, and in a funny way, I think it's quite a good thing, because world leaders have a sort of an awful habit of mucking up everything. I mean, they destroyed the talks last year because they didn't have a clue what they were talking about. I mean, most world leaders are absolutely, totally ignorant, and they turn up in a meeting like this, which has been very carefully negotiated by diplomats and trade people and whatever, over a long period of time. The world leaders come in, they are given a choice, and they make a political choice. Fair enough. But if you want to get decent agreement, you need the negotiations beforehand. You need that careful thing, and that's what we're seeing much more of here. That's why these talks will not collapse in the same way, is because there are very few world leaders here. So there's much less grandstanding, there's far fewer presidents standing up and making their sort of enormous points or whatever. Yes, I mean, the media is always attracted to power. I mean, it's as simple as that, because that's the way these things operate. And the fact that not all the world's media is here, I don't think matters particularly at this point. I mean, by next year, when these talks are, at their final conclusion or reaching their conclusion, then you will see absolutely everybody.
But then leaders like President Obama can use that as a way to take pressure off of him at home. His base deeply concerned about global warming, but the question is, who is he catering to? And if he comes here, it'll raise the question once again. If he doesn't, he can be sure that most of the media that will cover him will not be here.
He came to Copenhagen last year. He made a complete mess of it, and he went back.
That's not how it was conveyed in the United States.
Well, no, but I mean, but the reality was that it was a disaster.
What did he do? What made the mess of it?
Well, he didn't have anything to offer. So he came here when Hillary Clinton had already made a financial offer and whatever. There was nothing for him to do. So he came and he started blaming China, which was like the maddest thing he could possibly do in that situation. And so it was a big strategic mistake, and it set the talks back absolutely enormously. So the presence of these guys, the big beasts of the diplomatic jungle, presence of these guys here can work. That's what they hoped last year. But it's a high risk strategy, and it can all fall apart. And that's what happens. And they're desperate not to go down that road again.
What about Kyoto? The Kyoto Protocol being dead. Japan, Canada, Australia saying they're not going to sign on to an extension.
I don't know about Australia, but. Yeah, I mean, it's a fairly extreme position, and so it'd be very interesting to see whether the other countries like Britain or Brazil or whoever can roll them back and get them to soften their position. Is it a negotiating position? It maybe is, so that next year they can gain purchase from it, and get credit. So when countries take a position here, it is very often for a very, very specific reason. So we don't need to be too alarmed by it yet, but I would say that it just leaves an awful lot of work to be done.
Guardian is one of the newspapers that released the WikiLeaks documents. The U.S. government is slamming on Julian Assange and WikiLeaks right now, basically many in the U.S. government are calling him a terrorist. What do you say about that?
Well, it's an outrage. It's absurd. I mean, you have to believe in in a transparent media and government. I mean, it's like It's absurd. It's absurd. I mean, this is America bullying an individual because it has been embarrassed. This is the elephant blaming the fly. America should clearly look to itself. I mean, its diplomats made those statements at that time. They were working in the public interest. They're paid by the public. Which is outrageous.
And the U.S. saying that the release of the documents will muck up diplomacy. Do you think that's a good thing?
It certainly may happen. I don't know how. I think diplomats may be a little bit more careful now about what they actually say. No, it won't muck up diplomacy, because diplomacy is very much of the moment. It may very much make countries think very carefully about what they commit to paper and computer.